Thanks so much, Nina. It's really great to be here. I love coming to UCLA. I've been coming for a number of years, and I actually love doing this. I think that having advice from editors about what you need for books, especially at a time where publishing is changing, is very valuable. Almost everybody who is your senior colleague or your professor has had to go through what you're going through, but your people are doing it at very different times. And the time shift, the requirements shift, the way of thinking about it shifts. So I always feel like by being out and explaining things, even though my explanation, I assume, will be different than somebody at Oxford or somebody at UC, it's really helpful to be able to actually hear things directly instead of having to learn on the streets. So besides Nina, I'd like to thank the Dean Schauberg, and Barbara for her help in putting this together. And often when people ask for a talk on advice on publishing, what they want is mechanics. How do you do this? How do you go out? How do you meet an editor? What's going to happen next? How long is it going to take? And I actually think the place to start is with genre. So this is the humanities, so I hope that's okay. But I think the real thing is to start with, well, what is your work? What's the work trying to say and do in the world? And then what form is it in when you get done defending your dissertation? So just before I get started, how many people have already published a book? There looks like there's some people who might have already done that, yeah? And later, if in questions, I'm happy to talk about second books, because I think they're an under-discussed problem. How many people are finished their PhD and defended and are working on something in progress? How many people are writing dissertations now, or in process of becoming a person writing a dissertation? So there's a good range of things. I always like to caution that anybody who's in the process of writing the dissertation cannot go home with the advice I give and start over, or decide that they have to stop writing for any given period of time because they're too in shock that things are going to be different than they expected. You have to keep writing because that's one of the lessons. And the reason that it's a lesson is because if you think about what makes a dissertation a genre, it's very peculiar. You're writing for people, the most obvious thing is you know who they are before you actually write. They've agreed to read it before you've even written it. And for most people, it's pretty easy to just kind of do a mental exercise of like, oh, if I were doing this at Berkeley, who would be on my committee? If I were at Chicago, who would be on my committee? If I were at Columbia, who would be on my committee? And see where you'd be pushed to be like more Deleuzian or less Deleuzian or in any number of different directions. So while nobody on a committee, I hope, is ever telling their PhD students, write this the way I would write it, you still would be kind of silly to write knowing that there was an audience of 5 paying no attention to what they would like to read or not. But I think that's actually the more trivial part. The really structuring thing, I think, is the presumption that they're going to read to the end. So that when you have a defense, the people that maybe they have or they haven't, that's between them and all, but all of California has pitched in to pay them to read this, and they agreed in advance before you wrote it. And it allows a structure to a dissertation that's very unusual and very different from a book. So there's often like a kind of groundwork. Here's the theoretical background, here's the historical background. Then there's a bunch of examples that kind of add up and move in some order, theme to theme. And then at the end, there might be some suppositions about what it might all add up to. And that's okay, because they're all going to get there. And I think at some defenses, people are told, oh, so what you're really trying to argue here is, and then they go, yeah, that's right. That is what I'm trying to argue. And it actually doesn't really matter, because what you're doing is showing you can do a certain kind of research and a certain kind of work. And the group of people who sent you off and approved that as a project, then you come back and you say, here it is. And that's actually great. And if there's one chapter that goes on way longer because the archive was really rich, or you just had a lot to say about those poor novels from the 20s, then that's okay because they'll make their way through it. And if another chapter kind of rushes a little because you have to defend because you were accepted into a postdoc that required that you had defended before you could take it, everybody in the committee is actually interested in you getting to move along. But the main thing you're showing is a certain kind of research and a certain kind of reading or hearing that shows you've learned what you're supposed to learn. When you get to a book, I think the hardest thing is figuring out what do you want to argue. You're not doing the book, even though the book might, we hope, play a role in you getting tenure. That's not the reason for writing the book. The reason for writing the book is to demonstrate something to somebody. And dissertation often is not about that. So it's like, what does it mean to structure research and writing that was done with one kind of idea in mind into something else? And that's actually, I think, one of the most difficult things, because not every bit of research really produces an argument right away. But so you can finish and you can think like, oh, this was approved. What do I have here? And you might have something that's very thick, but it's not necessarily an argument. And that can happen in two ways. One, I think often you get a dissertation topic out of some kind of positivist, here is a niche that no one's looked at before, and so that would be a good topic because then you'd have a niche. In anthropology, pardon the non-humanities example. In anthropology, there's a thing now located at Yale called the Human Relations Area File, which was a kind of positivist mapping of the world. So you could say like, oh, here's Cuba, here's Santiago de Cuba, here's Cuban music in Santiago de Cuba. Oh, no one's written about reggaeton in Santiago de Cuba. I wonder what that is. So you could find your niche that way, which could turn out to be an argument or not. It's a really kind of positivist motor that doesn't actually represent what becomes a contribution to scholarship at all. It just becomes like how you find this place. Another way can be through chapters that are thematic, but not necessarily planned to add up to something. So sometimes this happens in literature or other kind of aesthetic reading kinds of dissertations where there's a theme. And I have a very old and overused example, but the person's now a full professor and a department chair, so I guess I can use it, which was from the 90s. And it was a book on passing in American literature. And some of the novels or memoirs were passing black to white, some were passing white to black, some were canonical, some were non-canonical, some were 19th century, some were 20th century, all of which would place her very well on the job market because you could apply for the different kinds of jobs. And as a dissertation, they're all very well read. And then in the end, you say, well, what does it add up to? And really it adds up to, it's complicated. You know, they're all different, which is actually a good thing to produce out of a set of readings. But then, would I read a book to find out they're all different? You could just say like, oh, here are all these different situations with passing narratives. Do you think they'll all be the same? Be like, no. So that then the kind of question of like, what do you take this material and turn it into something you want to say? And what is that going to be? And how do you get that in a kind of short and clear way that you could use it to say to somebody else? So sometimes you learn that on the job market. Sometimes you learn it applying for postdocs. But it's actually very hard to do, not to be like saying it in terms of turning somebody else's bad idea into a better idea or building on other work. I want to complicate this. It's actually about having a straightforward argument. And I kind of keep in mind two impossible examples, which are useful even as they're very impossible, which is Said's Orientalism and Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. Because in both books you get to page 2, nobody's been cited, nothing, no background about why the person can write the book has been stated, but you have an argument, which you might disagree with or might have disagreed with the first time you read it. And then the book proceeds in a very different way from that argument being stated up front, right at the beginning, than it would be if it were just building out of evidence. You read differently, and what you need to hear to be convinced is a very different kind of thing. So a lot of the difficulty of figuring out how do you revise your dissertation into a book is where do you start? Do you start by, a lot of times I think people start by going back to where they left off. Oh, chapter 4, if I had just had a little more time in that archive, that would have been that much better. Or that one was finished in a rush, it never was really happy, or at my defense, somebody gave me a look and I thought, oh, that's not really very good. But my advice would be to figure out what is that chapter going to do in this new book. Once it's a book and it's structured around the argument, is that chapter going to be there at all? And it's not that the work won't be there, it's that it might be represented in a very different way than the structure that was in the dissertation structure. And the question is, well, how much evidence does someone need to be convinced? So we all read the same stuff. You all have the experience where somebody has kind of convinced you of something and then gives you another example. And then you're like, okay, I got this already. I'm not dumb. And I will now date myself, but in the 80s, Talking Heads spin-off, the Tom Tom Club, had this, they had a song called Genius of Love that was sampled in a lot of rap songs and was an early kind of white, we're not really rapping, but we're using some verbal things, kind of new wave effort. And they had another song called Wordy Rapping Hood that was about words and what they do. And somewhere through that song, someone in the background yells, "That's okay, I've overstood." Which I think is actually a beautiful concept. Because it's like you're convincing a smart reader who's going to read your book of some argument. How much evidence do they need? So if you go back to the dissertation, more evidence just shows you did more work. Oh, wow, that was really a thorough reading of that archive. That's great. Whereas in the book, it's like, okay, who's going to need that and why? And so I think of it a lot of times the way like a filmmaker might go out and shoot footage for months, but that's not the film. The film has to have a pacing and a rhythm, and it has to kind of both introduce itself and get the audience to want to come along at the same time. So it's like, how long does this scene need to be? You know, do you need my whole reading of Oscar Wilde? Or might it be just good to have like a paragraph on the assumption that most people who read my book, who are reading my book, have already read that, and I can just make an aside that's a very short point. So to try and figure out what that is, you actually have to know the argument, otherwise you won't know what people need to be convinced. So I think it's good to either start by writing an introduction, which you'll have to rewrite many times in the course of things, but as a kind of place to try and get yourself to decide, you know, and get other people who will call you on when that introduction is just like, well, Judith Butler says this, and Kasia Silverman said this, and I think the position's in the middle, and really kind of get it down to something you want to say that could be said in your own language without citing anyone. And that's very hard to do, and part of why it's hard to do is most of the things we look at actually are complicated. But you have to find the thing that you're willing to commit to, that you're willing to argue, and you know, this could be about, for a historian, making a narrative structure. It could be for, in other kinds of forms, doing some other genre kind of work other than a kind of critical argument with examples, but you still have to tie it down so everything's working around the genre decisions that you've made. And that means thinking about who you want to read it, which is another kind of interesting point that you didn't have to think about in the dissertation, and being realistic about that and committing to that as well. So just the same way you have to commit to your argument, you have to commit to who it's for. So a lot of times people have very different audiences they'd like to reach. Mom, the undergrads that they might be teaching who are really interested in their work, senior colleagues in the field who are they hope to impress, people who they're paranoid about, who always, whenever they give a talk, ask some difficult question to try and throw them off their game. And what it's hard to do is not write for each of those in succession. So that you can't, and this is true especially in interdisciplinary work, where you can't have one thing, oh, this is for the science studies readers, and this is for the musicologists. The same people have to be able to read all the way through. So how do you think consistently about the audience and then find a voice that you can hold to consistently throughout so that audience could actually get all the way through the book? And that is challenging because it's too hard when you're at a certain point not to fall back into one of those readerships or not. But you have to be able to figure out how you make it legible for the reader and pull them along in a way that they'll want to keep reading. And then some of that also is about form, so that if you wanted to teach it to undergraduates, how long a thing would you teach to an undergraduate now? So how long does the book have to be if that's what it's supposed to do? If it's supposed to cross interdisciplinarily, when do you decide this is a book I should really be reading, and when do you think, oh, actually, that looks interesting, but it's so long, maybe that's for people just in the field. So to really try and kind of test out what it is that you want to see the book do by trying it out. Both, I think, interdisciplinary, trying it out by getting readerships in the other disciplines. So if you want historians to read it, try being in a writing group with some historians and see whether they think it actually counts or not, or whether it's enough if the evidence really seems like evidence. It's a kind of challenge of our interdisciplinary moment, and especially the argument-driven book, that they are supposed to reach different audiences. So how do you do that? Everyone has a different ear for what needs to be there for it to work for them. And then I think you have to be realistic about circulation now, so that we were talking at lunch about edited collections. And there's a certain kind of edited collection I think of as done for bookstore circulation. You walk into a place, you see it, you think, oh, I kind of need to know, look at this, all these essays on Agamben, I need to know what these people think, I should pick that up. And you didn't go in for that, you might have gone in for something else, but you recognize that you're interpolated. If you think about what might get reviewed in the LA Review of Books, our most important, wide circulating review media for intellectual stuff at the moment, then that's going to have a different criteria. If you're thinking about something that should cross over to an actual trade audience, there's a different criteria. And so you have to think about how the way you structure it is going to help you reach that or not. So I think once you think through these things, it's actually very helpful to back up and then do something that's like a treatment would be for a film. So what do you expect to happen in the book, in what order? And that's going to change as you do it, but to really try and write to that rather than just letting it go and letting each chapter go as far as it goes. You know, different people write in different ways. Some people might be happy letting the chapter go as far as it goes because that's how they get the ideas and then cut it down later. But I think the more you know in advance, oh, I've thought through what I'm going to say and can work to that, then that's a much better way to do it. So That's, for me, knowing this stuff and having that in control is the very first part about getting something published. The more practical part is about how you find the place where what you're trying to do will be recognized. So as an editor, I get pitched lots of things. Some I fully recognize. I see like, wow, oh, this is going to be, this picks up this, and there's stuff on infrastructure here, and then here's the Palestinian Authority, and it's going to like get all these different pieces all together. Other things are going to be at a distance, like, oh, I never really thought about that medieval poetic form, because I never did. So you need to be able to locate where the book will be legible, and then think both about who you would be working with, are they going to understand it, and then how the book will appear under different imprints. I really feel like the same book will look like a different book from Cambridge, and from California, and from us, and from Illinois. And it could be exactly the same book, but people will ascribe different things to it. The process will also push it in different ways, which I can talk about. But even if it were exactly the same, people would ascribe different things to it. So how do those different things comport with what you're trying to do? And then who do you feel comfortable talking to about it? So those are two kind of related things that assume you actually feel comfortable talking about it and you know what it's supposed to do. When you need to meet editors, you can do it at events like this, which are good things. You can do it at academic meetings, which is the kind of conventional way of doing it, to write ahead of time. You can just write someone out of the blue and hope that they are cathected, have enough time at the moment that they get the email, and cathect on it in a way that they write back and say, wow, that sounds really great. But you want to make some contact as much as possible before you just send something in blind. I've published many things from people I'd never heard of and had never met. I've published things from places that academic institutions I'd never heard of. So, it's not about a kind of old boy network of who you know and needing to get close to editors. It's different field to field. I'd say Asian studies is still more that way than Asian American studies, completely not that way. But you don't need a kind of network. You need something that's going to get somebody's attention. So that could be an email that describes what it is and puts that kind of key sentence, this is what I'm trying to argue, right up front. It could be something that has a kind of cool, hooky, not as long as an anecdote you'd find in a book, but a little hooky thing that somebody might cathect on, and then the argument. It might be just as straightforward as, I'm going to be at ACLA next week. Are you or somebody at the press going to be there? But if you can meet with somebody and find out how that press works, it really helps a lot. Most university presses and places like Palgrave or Routledge, because they want to publish academics, have some combination of a review process and a faculty board. But what that combination is varies completely. So for us, we send something out for review. If the reviews are good, we send it out to 2 people. It's single blind. That means that the readers know who you are or what your name is. They can Google you, but you won't know who the readers are. It's single blind. And if the reports are good, then I can get the author to write a reply and usually offer them a contract on that basis. Then they would have a contract. It's the only contract they ever get. It's a full contract. But they go off and revise or finish. And then we send it back out for review again. Is it ready? Is it now, here's something you thought had all this promise? Is it really ready to go? Is it soup yet? And then if it is, then we bring it to our faculty board at the end. So that's our process. Chicago, Minnesota, some other places, Right at that first time before there was a contract, it would be at the board, and then the revisions might be between the author and the editor. So one purpose, besides interesting editors, is learning from them. What's the process that I'm going to be in? What's going to happen in what time frame and in what order at that press? And what's their attitude toward review? So I never send out anything that I wouldn't want to publish if it were good. I turn down lots and lots of things, but people are doing peer review as a very big favor to the profession. If you think about like volunteering to read a 300 or 400 page unfinished manuscript for $150 or twice that in books that a press publishes, that's actually a lot of work for very little compensation. So usually people are doing it because they're invested in the press and they're invested in the field. And some combination of that triangle, for me, is very magical. People give advice that they might not give the author directly because they are concerned about the press. And because that little bit of single blindness makes it just kind of different than being in a conversation with someone where you were directly telling them what to do. So I think of it as the difference between having a problem and talking it over in therapy and then going home and thinking like, okay, now I see how I have to change, and going out for a beer with somebody and them saying exactly the same thing, but it having no effect whatsoever, except you had a beer and talked to somebody. But I look for people who are going to actually want the project to succeed. So I want somebody who if I told them what the book was trying to do, they'd be like, wow, that sounds really cool. And then would be honest enough to say whether it succeeded or not. Because if it's just somebody from a different part of the field who thinks all that kind of work is bad, you're not really learning anything. And all the reviews kind of go down on the permanent record. You want them to actually be constructive. And you as an author want to learn from them. And I as an editor want the book to be improved. So I look for people who are going to want it to work, but then will tell me whether it is or isn't. It's a very odd thing. I think there are other places that are more gatekeepery. It's a different version of it, so that would be something you could talk to an editor about. Reading the reviews is hard, and you can talk to anybody in the room who's had peer review, or perhaps you've had them for articles. But actually reading them and thinking of them as constructive requires a little unreading and a little distance. So a lot of times people are very caught up in what the advice that they get is. And I almost always think that's the last thing to get focused on. What I'm looking for is, where did somebody hit a speed bump? Where were they reading along and they lost track of what the argument was? Or they didn't know why the chapter was going on so long, or they overstood, or they lost where they were. They got the argument was really clear in the first couple of chapters. By 3 and 4, we were in kind of related areas, but we had kind of lost where we were going in the book. And that's the kind of feedback they'll usually say, well, if I were you, I would do this. They don't really come out and say that, but they give some advice which is projected in that way. They're usually doing some work that's very different than the author. So they'll say, well, what you might try is this, and the authors often can respond by no, that doesn't get my work at all. Why would I do that? Whereas in fact, what you want to focus on is, why was that something that someone thought needed fixing? What was going on there that they got lost? And sometimes that's the solution to that the author comes up with is much simpler than what the reviewer suggested. It's like, oh, I forgot all about that question which had come up in chapter 1 by the time I got to chapter 5. I think it would be good to have 5 or 6 pages recapping that discussion in this later chapter. It's like, well, maybe 3 lines, 2 pages ahead of that place in the manuscript actually brings it back to the reader's mind in a different way. But you want to do it it's very different than giving a talk. I'm giving a talk, if we have questions and so on. Why did you start by saying this? Then you explain why you did what you did. in response to readers' reports, your motivation in making the manuscript a certain way is the most boring thing ever. Because that, well, not ever, but it's not very useful, because when the person gets the book, you're not going to be there to say, oh, the reason chapter 5 is confusing is because I wanted both to cover this and that, or I had both of these things that I need to get to, so I pushed them into one chapter. You need to be able to make it work for the people who are actually going to read the book later on. So the advice is to take the advice, not so much, why did this person do this when I'm doing that, but how do I make what I'm trying to do work? So I think before I open up for some questions, the last thing I want to talk about is follow-through. I was on giving a talk about publishing on Friday at Bard, and there was an editor from Cornell, and there was an agent who was sort of funny because it was like this kind of audience. It was, well, they're not graduate students at Bard, but junior faculty. And why they need an agent wasn't really clear to me, but you had this kind of language that was from the trade publishing, which would be like Penguin or Random House language, which is an author needs a platform. So from that point of view, she's like, well, it's not good to just have a topic. You need to have an association with the readership and a way you're going to get the ideas out there. It can't just be a Twitter account. It's very not helpful, I thought. But the idea of the kind of follow-through that you have to have is actually helpful. So if you're doing the interdisciplinary book, there's like things you can do ahead of time to actually be on the radar of the audiences you hope are reading it. So if you're doing something on film and Chinese history under Mao, then go to the film conference, just don't just go to Asian studies. You have to develop the audiences that are going to be interested in you in different places. It's both career building, it's partly like giving your work in places where people can not get what you're doing and then give you feedback and suggestions that help you improve it. And then once the book comes out, it's a part of creating the audience for people who are going to go like, oh wow, Nina's book is out. I've been waiting for that. And that's a kind of thing that you actually want to produce. And then sometimes, especially if the book comes out a little too close for comfort to the tenure process itself, people can be justifiably exhausted. Like, oh, I did all this work, I got tenure, now I just want to go lie somewhere under the covers. And it's actually the worst time to do that, because some project that you've been working on for probably 10 years by that point, other people are hearing about it for the first time. And you really need to go out and give the talks for an audience who could actually be excited, because like Gil Hochberg's book that's back there, that just came out this week. How long has Gil been working on it? For a really long time. But then for all the people who are seeing it, then this is like, wow, this is the new thing. So you have to go out and instead of like, okay, my book just came out, but here's my new project, you really want to get out and go around and give some talks about it. So I think you're probably getting the idea that this is a longer time frame than you might have imagined, especially dissertation writers. And I sometimes think of it as if you were hiking, and I'm not that much of a hiker, but I've done it enough for this. You sometimes like see where you think that the hill ends, and then you get there and you realize you're going around the corner and it's about to go up again. And that's a lot, this process of the dissertation turning into a book. And you have to feel good about it, because retrospectively, when you look back on it, there's no other time you have as much time to work on one project. Especially for grad students, there's rarely a time where you have a cohort willing to read each other's writing and with the time to focus on it. And then the kind of support and time frame of stuff like this, events like this, to actually help you figure it out. People who are trying to write their second books as associate professors when they've become eligible for a whole extra level of work, or full professors with even more work they're eligible for, that's much harder to do. So this is, even though it can feel abject to be writing the dissertation, it's actually a luxury because it's really the focus that you have. And to just not to assume that when it's done, that becomes the book, but then to think, okay, I did that. This is the start of my career. Who do I want to be? And it's really I meant to say this earlier, but it's really a shift in voice. So like your writing voice is partly like the style of writing, but it's also your authority. And you're going from somebody who's writing the dissertation, trying to get people to say, is that okay? Is it okay enough? To somebody when the next generation of grad students picks up your book and opens it, they're going to assume you are the authority on this. And it's about inhabiting that and getting rid of the nervousness that maybe I don't have the right to say this, or more senior people, if they had written this, it would be better. And to actually write as if you have the confidence that you will have through writing it, that makes a really big difference. So why don't I stop there, and I'd love to have questions or just address anything that I could help with.
I just want to open up the question period by asking a question and also by saying the same thing I said last time, and I will reiterate now, that this is an opportunity to really ask the questions you would like to have an answer for. So I was having coffee with Ken before we walked over here, and I said, I'm imagining this as having invited you, Ken, into our living room. So we're in our living room now, we're across the coffee table from a distinguished editor, but we have the opportunity to ask questions that might be difficult to ask in other situations. But I wanted to ask the first question, which you already laid a kind of breadcrumb, or multiple breadcrumbs, so connecting to breadcrumbs here. The second book, or maybe the third book, looking at people in this room, if you can speak to that, and also then might be more on people's minds, or maybe not, who are in that stage, how different presses, you mentioned this, how different presses might push your book in different directions, or just facilitate for the book to become what it becomes, or like you actually said, how just the perception of people coming to the press will have them read it differently, and that's why it might end up doing different kind of work in our field. But second, third.
Those are two very different questions. How the book might be pushed has to do with what do people recognize in the book. So if I'm having a conversation with somebody and I get excited about a particular theoretical issues, and that's why I'm interested in the book, I assume they're going to go home and play those up. Whereas if somebody were really nervous and said, I don't know about all this gender stuff, then you might have a little less impetus to include that in the book. So there's partly that, and then a lot with the review process, because I'm choosing reviewers who are projecting onto the book, is this a Duke book? So sometimes we get reviews and say, this is a really good study, but it's missing that special cutting edgeness, it's missing that originality that I think of as Duke books. Of course, it's up to the editors, but so there's something that's in the review process, both who you choose and what they're going to look for, that will push it. You know, if there was a book on Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, and you sent it to one publisher sent it to Dutch philologists, and who would push it into a very archival depth sort of way, and I sent it to a post-colonial person and cultural anthropology Indonesianists, then you're going to get the manuscript itself pushed in really different directions. So I think that's a big part of the process. The thing with the second and third book is it's treated as if you already learned to write a book. It's not your first book. And I compare it, you'll hear this again, but I compare it to like riding a bicycle, where no one ever thinks they have to teach you how to ride that bicycle. You're just supposed to be able to get on and figure it out. But as soon as you break down the parts of writing the book, everything about it is different. And it's as if like it's not that hard to figure out, but there's no structures of the academy, usually, for actually addressing that. So you're not revising something. The thing that you're not revising doesn't start with an advisor who goes, if you try and do all that, you're never going to finish. Why don't you just focus on this? That's plenty to talk about. So there's not that person. You're teaching or not teaching, or your time, if you're an anthropologist or a historian, your archival time, your ethnographic time is really different. So there's less of the, how long does this percolate? How much time can I spend in an archive trying to figure out where the there is that I want to talk about? But I think the biggest thing is the not revising. And it's really the opportunity to say, what do I want this book to do? Which you could do in the first book, and then choose how you're going to do it. But I think people often have gotten so kind of, revising is how you write, that they'll take a bunch of essays that they've published and try and, like a jigsaw puzzle that doesn't really fit, put them in different orders and see what kind of story that would tell. And then how would I revise that into a book? Or maybe I could just collect them and write an introduction. So it's really that you haven't kind of seen, I think the more books you write, the more you realize each thing is its own genre. My partner has done about 14 books, and every time she's always like, I never really wrote something like that. And sometimes it's about the voice, sometimes it's about the relation of evidence to argument, sometimes it's like, this is with a certain kind of artworks, or this is for a trade audience, or this is a narrative history, or this is a book for teaching. So the more you write, the more you realize, like, unless you do exactly the same kind of work over and over again, then it's like, which you can do, but then a lot of times people would like to stretch as a scholar. I have a funny conversation, I hope she doesn't mind me telling this, but an author who's an anthropologist, and her first book was about class differences of Asian American high school kids in Silicon Valley, and the class differences that would get played out on the playground. And now she's just written a book about advertising firms that use Asian Americanness as a kind of market that they sell to companies as like, they're Asian American run firms, but they're kind of selling that as a market that you need to address, so you need a firm to take on that for you. And she did an ethnography of that. And then she was talking to me about her third project, and she was going to do South Asians in spelling bees, which is a good topic. There are a couple of people working on it. I was like, wow, that's really the third book that's kind of doing the same kind of thing in a row. Maybe you'd like to be a theorist. Maybe you'd like to write something from a different angle and talk about how to do these things. And it turned out, no, she wanted to do the spelling bees instead, and who could blame her? But it's at least a question that I think once somebody asks themselves, or you're asked to do, like, would you write the shorter intro to vocals for Oxford? Then you get forced into a place where the genre is different, and then you have to figure those things out. So that's the other way that it happens. But I've been on a couple panels on the second book, one here, one at Cinema Studies, one at Duke, and the majority of people, the thing they thought they were going to write their second book on when they finished the first did not turn out to be their second book. So I started to think like, it has a function, which is to get you to finish. You have an idea of a second book, maybe it's time to finish. Which is actually another problem with the second book, which is there's no tenure. So you've already got tenure, usually. So then what's making you decide you have to get done at a certain time? And we all know there's some people who just like get up in the morning and get it done, and they're done way before tenure. There are other people who need the clock. I always picture like the kind of bulletin of the atomic clock, scientists from Chicago, where like it's counting down closer to midnight, and like people are trying to move it back a second or two to like postpone their tenure so the book can get over the line. So the people who have trouble writing and don't really love writing, but might be great researchers and teachers, what's the thing that forces them to kind of finish a second book instead of just explore one? There's a question back there?
We just see you raise your hand. And please stand up when you ask your question. First question.
No, there's a question back there.
Well, it's just a comment. I mean, Nina, if I could just make a comment. I mean, it's extraordinarily optimistic, this presentation. I mean, first books, second books, third books, all in the humanities. I mean, you have a large humanities list. It's really invigorating. And of course, there are other publishers, as we know, who are thinking a lot about whether the academic monograph within the humanities particularly has a future. So I don't know whether you would like just to comment on that debate. It seems like a very urgent one. It has big implications for tenure, especially in disciplines where the size of an audience is a really pressing question.
Yeah, that's a good question in two ways. One, I am optimistic, and it's partly because I believe, in work. I believe in people's work. And I think the worst reason to decide to change what kind of work people should do would be because the market for that work has changed in ways that really don't have anything to do with what's interesting, which I know affects hiring or anything else. How many classicists do we need? How many Hellenists do we, that any field has those pressures. And, one thing I haven't said is most university presses lose money on the books that they publish, us included. And we break even as a whole, as a part of Duke, because we have about 45 journals, and that picks up a little piece of the sky that makes the whole thing work. But what's interesting to me is there's very complicated patterns about what fields have things going on in them and not. What areas sell and which don't, what books cross over and what don't. And some things are kind of addressable and some are not. There's an example I always use, which is a book that has a monographic area of 1, which is this book we published by Martin Manalanson called Global Divas. And so you might know the book. So it's about Filipino men who grow up in Manila, very cosmopolitan and very Americanized place, move to northern New Jersey, and if they have same-sex relations in the way they did in Manila, are racialized and read as pre-modern in a kind of inseparable move. So instead of like the kind of normal intersectionality where it's like, oh, they've come from the Philippines to New York, and their gender and their sexuality and racialization, it's inextricable. And nobody's ever come to the press saying, do you have any books on Filipino gay men in northern New Jersey? But the book has sold about 6,000 copies. And it's because there's an idea. So the same way it's easy to think of influential books that are used all the time with an idea and a way of telling the idea that actually communicates. So that's always a source of my optimism, is the conditions of finding which books those are changes, but there's always a way to do it. And part of the idea of saying, like, know what your argument is, and who do you want to address, is you could write those books. So that there's partly that. That said, there are certainly things where you would have a harder row to hoe. Trying to get, if you're working on Silver Age Spanish drama, it's going to be harder to get a lot of people to read it, even if your argument is a really good argument. So it's not, I don't believe that it's true across things. It's also very disciplinary. So what do the different disciplines do? What do we all do with the kind of books that we write? So that in anthropology, part of the reason that book was so successful is anthropologists teach what they write. That's what you'd use in a class. If he had been a literary critic and had the same argument about intersectionality, people would have chosen one of the novels and taught that. And then if somebody were really interested, they'd say, oh, you should check out Martin Manalanson's book, at the library. So that's a kind of social fact that is part of the landscape in the humanities is, are people just using e-reserves? Are they teaching books? Are they just teaching, somebody once said, like, we expect people in English to write these books, but we never ask them to read them. Like, how are you going to find out how they work? So if it's just like a whole bunch of chapters and articles, then what is the investment of the discipline in doing that kind of work, and who is it for? So that said, I think, when I look at the areas that we've had a kind of freedom, which I've really enjoyed, which is to look for where stuff is interesting. Like all the things that Nina read off that I'd acquired in, I couldn't acquire in them all at the same time. But I like to have an ear for where is some movement that's a little kind of faster than normal, more intellectually adventurous than normal. Something's really going on. Something surprising is going on in the subfield. So that's my taste in how to look for something. I always feel like if I see what the book is about and what the approach is, and I can predict what it's going to say, then it often feels like the machinery's clanking on, turning out, pardon the modernist model. Whereas I like something that's like, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way. Or, wow, that's a really useful concept. I could see that makes sense with this over here. But there are other presses with really different approaches. And one of the kind of weirdnesses of the decentered university press landscape, not to mention Oxford and Cambridge, which even though when you get to a promotion committee, those are very highly thought of presses, they actually publish the most books by far. 3,000 or 4,000, we publish 120 books a year. They're publishing 3,000 or 4,000 books a year. So there's a lot of different places and a lot of places where somebody would like to be good at something. So like, oh, no one's publishing in African literature, so maybe it's going to be Ohio State, or maybe it's going to be Kent State, or some press that you wouldn't necessarily go to for something else, but becomes the place that, oh, they've won the prize in this area 5 out of the last 8 years. So it's a little laissez-faire, which makes me uncomfortable, but at least at the moment, that kind of distribution of things is very helpful. The other thing that's happened is a little like what's happened with journals. So when I started at the press, the cool journals were things that you would see, Critical Inquiry, which we don't publish, Social Tech, you would see them in really good bookstores and be like, oh, that's really getting around. In fact, the bookstore sales never did much to help the journals. What helped the journals was library sales and individual subscribers. Now, because mostly everybody reads the journals online, there are almost no individual subscribers. And libraries often don't want the print journals. They just want a package of all the Duke journals or all the Johns Hopkins journals and Project Muse or something. So people have started, that changes the economics. You can add a journal now to our press or other presses without there being a lot of individual subscribers. So you'll see like Routledge inventing the Journal of 19th Century Indian Photography. It's like, oh, is that a field big enough to support a journal? Well, maybe not if everybody had to be an individual subscribing to it, but if you can now say Routledge offers 2001 journals in the humanities, then you can charge the library that much more or whatever. So books are starting to get packaged in very similar ways. So then that maybe becomes part of the way that the person who is working on Silver Age Spanish drama, the book becomes something that gets read and circulated because it's part of something that's like, oh, here's all of university scholarship online or something. So it's going out as part of the bigger package rather than having to succeed or fail on its own. I'm really attached to the actual book as something you might read whether on an electronic device or as they're in paperback. You'll notice we put everything out simultaneously. We try and charge prices that people could afford, because I think the people who buy books are grad students and junior faculty the most. and the more senior people wait till they are told that they have to read something by their grad students. And so I think they should be affordable, but you can certainly look at other models like Cambridge. Oh, this is the only book on Heraclitus coming out this year. You work on Heraclitus, you're buying it, whether it's $150 or not. So let's make it $150, and if we sell 400 copies, that's what we do. So that's a long answer, but I think that's the source of mine. It's not so much an optimism as a kind of a movable set of strategies for moving forward. Yeah, thanks.
I have another question about optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in terms of the timeline of publishing related to the tenure track.
Uh-huh.
And given that there are certainly tenure faculty here, there's a lot of graduate students
Uh-huh.
who are entering postdocs, entering inserted,
Mhm.
entering adjunct world. So I'm curious now, there's increasingly less every year tenure track jobs. Are you seeing any shift in sort of the timeline of publishing that people are choosing or that they're encouraging? As opposed to the standard model of the, that you talked about.
I'm seeing people with books earlier in the career, people who are still in postdocs or have had to have like a couple postdocs in a row, who've already done, they've had more time, lucky postdocs, I guess, and have got their book really revised in their first or second year of a tenure track job or even before getting one. And so that's been a different thing. And I've also seen the kind of upping of the game of like who's hireable based on the assumption that you have a lot of people who have really interesting work and you're less operating on futurity in the way when you're just looking at people who are about to finish their dissertations in the way there's more pressure. So it's I think a complicated landscape. I think it's actually helping people focus on their work because if you get to be like, a president's postdoc here or Michigan Society of Fellows or something, and you have a couple of years of mentored revising, that's really great. But it's obviously uneven and the result is uneven. But I continue to believe that people who get their books done and the books can have an effect will get jobs. That even if somebody gets all the way to the end of the process and they're still in postdoc or adjunct land, that somebody's going to then read the book and go, wow, we could have them? That's great. And that possibility still holds in a believable way for me.
I'm sorry in advance, I guess it's a very naive question, but I would be curious in knowing how you choose the readers who are going to review the book at the beginning of the process, because, for instance, in a manuscript which would be very interdisciplinary, if you give the manuscript to one person in the humanities and another one in history, for instance, you will get very different reports because historians, in particular, and all the humanities people as well, have very specific demands.
Right.
And how do you reconcile the two?
I think of it like a test audience. So you really are like just the same way if you made a film and you want to see like, is the audience bored or are they laughing when they're supposed to be weeping? You want it to work. So if it really has an interdisciplinary address, I try and get people from different points of view who can be looking at it so that you can find out now whether it works in both directions or not. But often I'll take some combination. It's least useful to have two people from the same point of view. You want somebody, because at least for us, where most of the things are interdisciplinary, the problem is usually I can't represent all the points of view that it would be nice to be represented. But maybe somebody knows about the object and somebody knows about that kind of theoretical approach, or somebody's in one discipline, somebody's in another. But that trick of how do you make people who their work isn't like yours, think your work is good work, is part of the process. And I think even within a field, even within an approach, this is why I like the single blindness. As soon as somebody knows who it is, they'll be like, well, that's because Jane Gallup is so psychoanalytic in her feminism, and we all read books all the time that are very different than our own approaches, and we survive and we read them very well. And so it's not like the only books anyone can read are ones exactly like the ones they write. Oh, I'm sorry, I only read my own books. It's not something you ever really hear. So that kind of, how do you get something to be successful enough to work for people who you hope will read it is a big thing for me. And because usually, and especially with the kind of situation, the market part of the situation, when somebody goes, oh, well, that's true, but that's like the way geographers would look at it. I'm not really trying to address them. And that fits, the last thing I want is to have gotten interested in a book because I see a kind of broad group of people who might find it useful, and then find that cut down to like the narrow monographic, oh, here's just the people working on that topic. Because that makes it much more like, oh, for that it should be $150 from Cambridge. But I'll usually ask people if they have ideal readers. That it's pretty frequent for somebody to say like, oh, are there people you think would be really great? Who can't be like, oh, I'd love it if Angela Davis read this. They have to be like people who might be invested. And I'll also ask whether there's anybody who somebody thinks I might think of. I'm not going to send a feminist work to an anti-feminist scholar, but somebody I might think of, and I'm just not going to know the circumstances in the field, like, oh, we used to go out and now we don't speak, or something like that. So I want it to be the process, not some extra process thing. So, yeah.
So I'm about to file my dissertation. I wanted to know your opinion about this, like, embargoing your dissertation. I feel like I've heard a lot of different advice about it, because I guess we all at UCLA filed a request.
Right.
So I just wanted to kind of hear the pros and cons from your perspective.
There's a woman at Stanford, and I'm forgetting her name, but about 3 weeks ago, she's been posting a series on that question, and she talked to a bunch of editors. So it's pretty, I can't remember where it is, but I'll try and think about it. But it doesn't bother me because I'm not a positivist. I think like it's field specific. So if you were doing certain forms of biology that would have implications for drug development, then I've learned that people only give papers that they've already published because they're afraid somebody in the audience will go out and patent their thing ahead of them. Most of the work in humanities or narrative social science isn't like that. So I think, like, who would want to read a dissertation version, even if it was for free, over the book version of anyone's given work? Here's this process that's like 4 years of revising, cleaning it up, making it for readers, doing all this copy editing and everything else. And would you really go read the ProQuest version for free? I think mostly not. And that fear is left over from the positivist, oh, I discovered this, and here it is, and somebody might be just taking that information before I can get it into the book form. That's one side of the argument, which I think is like the true side. The more questionable side is what libraries do when they think they already have access to a dissertation. Do they still buy the book or not? And it's very hard to get information on that. Whenever we've looked, I don't feel like first books have less pickup from libraries than non-first books. But it's hard to tell because the way libraries buy books is very much by subject, and there are a lot of other things that go through it. But I think that's what people were worried about at first when libraries were like, oh, we already have this, as if having the dissertation would be the same as having the book. But for editors, I think there are probably some editors who would rather you didn't, and especially if you weren't revising much. that would be reasonable. You know, I don't think it's bad to put a couple of years on it give yourself some space to think about it, but I've never asked anyone, oh, well, I'm interested in that topic, but is your dissertation on ProQuest? I just ignore it. Yeah.
Ask about, you mentioned about crossover to trade audiences. And I was just wondering whether university presses, how much they are willing to commit to such books. I mean, do you mostly only concentrate on monographs that are field specific?
It depends a lot on the press. And in some places, most presses have some things that cross over to general audiences. I've done Fred Wesley, who was James Brown's band leader, his memoir, or Randy Weston, the jazz pianist's memoir. So there's no monograph there. But we do a lot of books on global black musics, so it fits a lot in our publishing list in that way. Some places the trade will be Yale has lots of trade, lots of books that would have come out from Knopf, probably Random House in the 80s, now might come out from Yale, or to a lesser extent Harvard, but both of them. Chicago has a really big trade profile. California has a big trade profile. Columbia has a big trade profile. Other places, they have trade audiences, but it's more connected to what the press does in general. Today, Texas got the Cookbook of the Year James Beard Foundation Award for a book on Oaxaca cooking, which is a big cookbook, and it's great. So you assume that funds some other things for them. But the idea that there's a general audience tends to be fairly mythic. So it's like, which part of the people who are going to buy a Randy Weston memoir, his life story? He's a jazz pianist who's now 89 and was one of the first American pianists to go on the tours to Africa in the early 60s and stuff. That's a particular piece of a trade audience. To get something that's like, at the level of like when California had the Mark Twain, was it a diary or a memoir? Whatever, his autobiography. That's very hard to do, and a mixed blessing, because you actually have some trade publishers have gone out of business with too much success, and because you have to print and deal with returns at a very different scale and very quickly. But like when the Thomas Piketty book took off for Harvard, that I'm sure made their budget in about 2 days, for the whole year. But it just depends on each list, and you have to look at it and see like who are they trying to reach and what means do they have to do it. Right before I came to Duke, I worked very briefly for California in Princeton and Basil Blackwell, going around to bookstores. And the surprising thing from California at the time, which was a long time ago, in the late 80s, was that the monograph subsidized the trade more than vice versa. So you think like, here's the book everyone's heard of, that's going to make more money. The actual dealing with Barnes & Noble and Amazon and lots of returns and having to print all the numbers, if you think like, 500 Barnes & Noble stores are going to put 3 copies in each store, and that's 1,500 books, and then 2/3 of them or 3/4 of them are going to come back, you need a very particular kind of business model. So we had a book that was by Amitava Kumar, who's at Vassar, and was reviewed in the Times last year, and we had to go back and reprint in 6 days and then go reprint again. And it's a really nice little book on Patna, and it's about like the place that's kind of off the infrastructure place, mapping of like the kind of contemporary Indian development, but still like has these artists from it, and this, it's just a little short thing. It's a great review. And then, mostly we have returns. so that it gets the kind of attention, it gives something to the profile of the press, but you're really entering a different form of circulation that's very hard to manage and succeed with. So it takes a lot of infrastructure and muscle to do it. And even for trade publishers, they have less of that than they used to. So my partners did a book with something that's now part of Penguin Random House in the 90s and got sent around, paid, go talk to radio stations, people pick you up at the airport and take you places, even for the paperbacking of an already published cloth book. 2 years ago, she did a book for Penguin. It got written up like it was a whole Virginia Heffernan column in the Times Online. There was all this attention. But when she went in, and her agent was like, oh, these are two of the best publicists in the business. And the publicists were like, our advice to you is to hire your own publicist. So it's become a sort of neoliberal thing, much more like everything at universities or at university presses, where it's outsourced to the person. Like, you do this yourself rather than this will be kind of done for you. And it's become much more blockbustery than it would have been. Like, all the resources go for Oliver Sacks's memoir, and that produces all the revenue. And the other things come out and they do something for the list, but that's not where the ad money or the other things go. Yeah.
You mentioned that it's probably not a good idea to just email an editor, please see attached, proceed. But I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on what might be called the dating phase of approaching presses at juniors, you mentioned academic conferences, and especially the question, how soon is too soon? What do you kind of sort of prepare?
That is a great question that I should have already addressed. It's never too soon to meet editors. I've met people as grad students who I stayed in touch with and ended up publishing their books. And so if it's just like, oh, I admire all the stuff at your press, I'm going to be at Asian Studies, do you have time for coffee? Here's what I'm working on. I'm not ready yet, but I'd love to talk to you. I think there are editors who will be like, yes, I would do that. For when to write and when to send things in, that's really the kind of biggest problem of the first book, because you want to know which editors are interested in it early, but in order to send something out for review, you usually need something written. So that the kind of, oh, here's a proposal, which could go as an attachment, here's what it is, that's fine. 2 or 3 pages plus a little cover paragraph, that's okay to send. Then somebody goes, wow, that sounds really great, what do you have? And you're like, well, actually, I'm hoping by the end of a year from October to have something to send out. So it's a very funny thing, because we have a little thing called solicited. So we wrote back to the person and said, yeah, that would be really interesting. And then we file it and wait for the material to come in. But if it takes a long time, then it's like, I believe I told you to send it, but I don't really remember anything about this. So that awakening of interest, which the proposal accomplished, then the interest dissipates, and then you're sort of starting over again with the actual material. But if you had something in the middle, it was oh, well, I'm glad you like the project, I am still revising, but I will be both at American Studies and MLA in the fall, and if you have time, could we have coffee at one of those places? That would be one way to approach it. And it varies by editor. There's some editors, I can never see how anyone does this because I'd go crazy, who will just stand in the booth all day and have people come up to them and say, would you be interested in X? The first time I did an academic meeting, it was history, and Stan Holwitz, who used to run the UCLA office for UC Press, was the editor, and I was just helping out because I was in the region and working for them. And people would just come up and say, could you be interested in this book on the shirtwaist fire? And he would just go, no. And I still like think of that as this kind of impossible ability to just go, no. Because I would be like, so tell me a little bit about what happens, or send me a proposal and then I'm glad to take a look at it, or wow, that sounds really interesting, but right now we're not really doing shirtwaist fire books. You know, and he was just like really good at, so I guess people who are like that can stand in the booth and just have people come up to them. I tend to make a schedule for each meeting where I'll have somebody at 8 o'clock for breakfast, and then at 9 o'clock for coffee, and 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, and then I'll meet somebody at lunch, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, from the time I arrive till the end. So I block that out in advance, and I try and vary people that I've never met before with people with work in progress and people that might be doing another book. So it really varies with the editors. But it's hard to say this. There's a lot of email. Like I feel like my job when it was about somebody mailing a hard copy to the press, it was a lot easier to manage the flow of being sure that everybody was replied to, being sure that, you know, even if somebody else was typing up a rejection letter, that they got one. The trouble with email is I'm here today. So all the time that I will spend here today and tomorrow talking to authors, other people are just writing, because why not? So that then the ability to like keep always caught up on those things. So I would not assume that no reply meant no. I would assume that no reply meant, oh, something might have happened here, and just write again and say like, oh, I want to be sure you saw this or something to see. I mean, you shouldn't have to do a lot of work, and somebody should be excited about it, so it could be a sign, but you'd at least want to make sure that somebody had focused for a second on what you were doing. And the old-fashioned way of writing in hard copy still actually produces something that has to be replied to in a different way, I think. There's a really good book that perhaps you already know about by William P. Germano that's published by Chicago called Getting It Published. He did 2 books, one's from dissertation to book, but Getting It Published is a great and funny read about all the mechanics of what you put in a cover letter, what needs to be in a proposal. It's really, really helpful and ethnographically accurate. There are a lot of different books on how to do it, and a lot of them I feel like, oh, this person actually doesn't know how it goes. Bill actually knows how it goes, so it's good. One more? Yeah, please.
Maybe Arla, I want to ask a small follow-up question to that, and then we'll take the last question, and then we'll move over into the reception. But let's say one of us are so lucky to have a first meeting with you. Let's say that person doesn't know you, so it's one of those emails, they blocked out the time with you. If it's a first-time author who hasn't had this kind of meeting before, what do you see your role to be, or on the other, or to ask it differently, how should the author prepare? Do the insecurities and questions around the projects come up? You have your ear to the field in a way that I don't know anybody do, actually, like the broad fields, I should say. So how much give and take is it? How much advice can the author seek at the same time as seeming confident? It's basically, how does one prepare for a first meeting with an editor, being confident at the same time as taking advice from an expert?
That's kind of the answer. I mean, you don't want to have like the whole pitch you would give at a job interview, because the person's, however interested they are, isn't in your field. They don't need to hear the whole thing laid out at a huge length, but you want to have some conversation. I like to give feedback. I like to hear what's interesting. I like to ask questions that might even push the project along, which is the advantage of like talking in an early stage. It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Other people might just be interested in commercial considerations, which is depressing but true. So you want to be prepared to talk about it. You want to be prepared to answer questions. You want to have some questions about the process at the press. You want to be upfront about where you are in writing. And you want to show some recognition, you know who you're talking to. So that's like a very common piece for writing an email. Instead of writing "Dear Editor" or "Dear Philosophy Editor" or something like that, writing to the person. And do watch out for mail merge, I would say. That's like where somebody will write to me and say, would Minnesota be interested in publishing my book? I've admired everything you publish for a long time. And they get the top to change, but forget that they put in the body of the letter the name of the press. But you want to say something about the recognition of like why this seems like a good list or what you were hoping to learn from it. So if you actually are like, this is the main place I want my book to be, and I've always imagined it there, it's okay to say that. And if it's like, I've really always respected what Cornell does in this area, and I'm not really sure if my project is a good fit, but I'd really love to talk to you about it, to be upfront about that as well. Or even, so-and-so always talked about you as a really helpful editor, and I really want to meet and discuss my project, even though it's at an early stage. So I think to be upfront, to not load it down, and for me, it's a kind of marathon of serial dating. So you want to pay attention to whether you still have the audience's attention the same way you would do if you were giving a talk. So if you're going on and on about chapter 4 and what happens in a certain juncture in this, when the Turks actually entered, then you want to just kind of go, oh, okay, hold on. Yeah. So to try and make it a real conversation, I think, rather than just like a presentation. Yes, please. Hi.
Thank you so much for your information. I have a question of point of clarification. Actually, in preparation for this paper, I read your website, and it said that one should send a hard copy for this proposal, etc. But now you seem to be giving an email. So maybe you just tell us your email address, or maybe you can tell us that we should send email, even despite what the press says, or what is the best thing to do?
I think it's a moment of transition. I tried to hold on to hard copies just for the process was all set up around them for a long time. But so many people write by email, you can't hold on to that unless you were just rude and made your own rules about it. So I think for a long time I think the website will probably change to being email. Mine is kwiss@duke.edu. But you can, you should look, that's exactly the thing to do, to go to each press's website and see what they prefer. It's always fine to write somebody and say, would you be interested in this? Or to send the proposal that way. And I should add, just because nobody's asked about it, the assumption that you're only submitting to one place, which is, in journal publishing, you could lose an acceptance often by if they find out it's also at another journal, is not the standard assumption of book publishing. You can certainly write query letters to as many presses as you want. Would you be interested in this? If you thought it was going to be productive, which I have questions about, you could certainly have more than one place sending it out for review. You'd have to be upfront about what you're doing. So then the presses can say, no, I won't look at it if you're doing that. And you have to know what you want the outcome to be. Because if it goes along, my experience is that in most cases like that, either it's something all the presses get positive reports, or none of them get positive enough reports, that the group of readers is going to recognize the same thing in it. So if all you're doing is postponing making a decision or having a safety school, like applying for a job, then it's not a good idea. if you really could picture the book doing two different things in two different places, and you're trying to figure out which is which, or you're trying to get Cambridge not to make it $150 in hardcover, but to bring it out simultaneously because they're competing with California, and California is going to do that, then there's an end game you can envision. But certainly along the way, you can write to more than one place and talk to different editors and see. If you just do it to see, to postpone it, you'll just end up attached to more editors who are more attached to your work and hoping to publish it and hoping not to have run all the work of the review process only to lose the book to someone else. Yeah.
I wanted to